Welcome home, my daughter. Welcome home, my daughter.
He built an empire on the promise that he never lost anything he wanted to keep. Then his mother walked past his bride, wrapped her arms around the woman he'd spent 3 years hating, and whispered 4 words that turned his wedding into a crime scene. If you believe loyalty deserves the truth, not silent judgment dressed as family, hit subscribe now, because this story is about to expose exactly who's been lying to who. Like this video if you already suspect Lady Kang knows something the whole family's been too scared to ask. Only the indifferent scroll past. He built an empire on the promise that he never lost anything he wanted to keep. Then his mother walked past his bride, wrapped her arms around the woman he'd spent 3 years hating, and whispered 4 words that turned his wedding into a crime scene. The ballroom of the Kang estate had been built for exactly this kind of spectacle. Soaring ceilings, silk banners, the color of old blood and older money, and enough security discreetly stationed around the perimeter to make a small nation nervous. Tonight, it smelled like orchids, imported champagne, and the particular anxiety of 300 guests who all understood, on some animal level, that they were watching a performance with live ammunition. Kang Min-jae walked in like a man arriving to collect an award he'd already been promised. Tall, precise, dressed in black the way undertakers and mafia bosses both understood as a kind of professional courtesy, he moved through the crowd with Seo Yuna glowing on his arm. She'd chosen a gown that caught the chandelier light like she'd personally negotiated terms with the sun, and for a moment, everything about the evening looked exactly as rehearsed. Min-jae had survived rival cartels. He'd survived corrupt prosecutors circling his empire like sharks smelling blood in clean water. He'd survived one memorable assassination attempt at a fish market that had ended, improbably, with an octopus vendor becoming his most loyal informant. He believed, reasonably, given the evidence, that he had a working understanding of danger. He did not. Because danger, it turned out, didn't always come with a gun. Sometimes it came dressed in his mother's favorite hanbok, moving across a crowded ballroom with the unstoppable calm of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted every rumor Seoul's underworld had ever whispered about her. Lady Kang's eyes swept past Yuna like the girl was an ambitious piece of furniture someone had left in the wrong room, and then she saw her, standing quietly near the garden doors, in simple charcoal, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world, possibly the moon, was a woman most of the guests hadn't seen in 3 years. Ama Serwa. Lady Kang crossed the ballroom, and every conversation in her path simply stopped, as if she carried silence in her wake the way other women carried perfume. She reached Ama and pulled her into an embrace so fierce it seemed to physically displace the air in the room. "Welcome home, my daughter." 4 words. That was all it took. The chandeliers might as well have gone dark for how completely those 4 words eclipsed everything else in the room. Champagne flutes froze midair. A violinist forgot the next note of a song he'd played 1,000 times without a single mistake. Yuna's smile stayed fixed to her face with what could only be described as sheer structural engineering. Beautiful, expensive, and one push away from collapse. Min-jae felt something crack in his chest. Not loudly, like a gunshot. Slowly, the way ice gives way beneath a man who was certain he knew exactly how much weight the lake could hold. 3 years. 3 years he'd spent believing Ama left him for weakness, for money, for the simple crime of not wanting to survive marriage to a man whose enemies communicated primarily through car bombs and anonymous flower deliveries with notes attached. He'd built an entire architecture of resentment on that story, floor by floor, room by bitter room, furnished with every 3 a.m. conversation he'd had with himself about how she'd abandoned him when it mattered most. His mother had just kicked out the foundation with the emotional equivalent of a stiletto heel in front of 300 witnesses and a wedding photographer who was, at this very moment, still live streaming to 12,000 followers. "Uma." His voice came out lower than he intended, sharper than he meant it. "What is this?" Lady Kang didn't answer him. She held Ama's face in both hands like a woman confirming a miracle was real, and something in her expression, grief, gratitude, guilt, Min-jae couldn't name it fast enough, silenced whatever he'd planned to say next. Because here was the truth clawing its way up through 3 years of careful, comfortable lies. His mother knew something. His mother had always known something. and whatever it was, it had just walked back into his wedding wearing charcoal gray and an expression that said she hadn't wanted to be anyone's storm. Somewhere behind him, Yuna's hand tightened on his arm, not for comfort, but for balance, like a woman realizing the ground beneath her marriage had just been quietly, expertly removed. The empire Minjae had spent his whole life building had survived cartels, prosecutors, and one very confused octopus vendor. It had never once been threatened by a hug, until tonight. The silence after "Welcome home, my daughter" didn't break so much as it curdled, thickening into the kind of quiet where 300 people simultaneously decided to check their phones for something to do with their eyes. Minjae stepped forward, and the crowd parted for him the way it always did, though tonight it felt less like respect and more like people clearing a blast radius. "Uma," he said again, quieter this time, close enough now that only his mother and Amma could hear him. "You invited her." "I did." Lady Kang didn't release Amma's hands. "I invite whoever I please to my son's wedding. Was there a rule I forgot about?" "You walked past Yuna. I noticed the dress. It's lovely. Tell her congratulations." Lady Kang's tone carried the particular cruelty of a woman being completely, devastatingly polite. Behind him, Yuna had recovered enough composure to step forward, her smile now doing the heavy lifting of an entire wedding's worth of dignity. "Mrs. Kang," she said warmly, extending a hand toward Amma like a woman determined to win a war she didn't yet understand the terms of. "I've heard nothing about you, actually. How strange." It should have landed as an insult. Instead, it landed as a confession, an accidental admission that in 3 years of courtship, Minjae had never once mentioned the woman he'd been married to before her. Amma's expression flickered, something between pity and exhaustion, and she took Yuna's hand anyway, because whatever else she wasn't cruel. "Amma Sirwa," she said simply. "I won't be staying long. You'll stay as long as I want you to," Lady Kang cut in, and there it was. The voice that had once made a room full of armed men reconsider their life choices. She turned to the crowd, still holding Amma's hand like evidence she intended to present in court. "Everyone, please, continue enjoying yourselves. My son is getting married. There is champagne, there is cake, there is no need to stand around staring like I've announced a war." Nobody moved. Minjae took his mother's elbow, steering her toward the study with the practiced gentleness of a man who'd learned long ago that manhandling Lady Kang, even affectionately, was a mistake made exactly once. "We're talking. Now." The study was where the real business of the family had always happened. Behind oak doors thick enough to survive a small siege, under the watchful oil-painted eyes of Kang ancestors who'd built an empire out of shipping routes, silence, and a talent for knowing exactly which secrets to keep buried. Lady Kang settled into the leather chair by the window like she owned the room, which, technically, she did. "You're going to explain this," Minjae said. "Tonight, not in riddles. I already told you everything you needed to know 3 years ago." Lady Kang's eyes, when they met his, had none of the softness she'd shown Amma in the ballroom. "You simply chose not to listen. You were too busy being heartbroken to be curious." She left. She packed a bag and disappeared without a word to anyone. "She protected this family," Lady Kang said, and for the first time that night her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for Minjae to hear the years underneath it. "While you were building glass towers and shaking hands with men who wanted you dead, she was the only person paying attention to the ones closest to you, the ones already inside the walls." Minjae felt the floor tilt. "What are you talking about?" Before Lady Kang could answer, the study door opened without a knock, a violation so unthinkable that Minjae's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket before his mind caught up with the fact that it was only Ho Jin, his mother's longtime advisor, silver-haired and grim-faced, carrying a slim black folder like it weighed considerably more than paper should. "Forgive the interruption," Ho Jin said, though his eyes were on Lady Kang seeking permission Minjae hadn't known she still needed to grant. "But if we're finally doing this tonight, you'll want to see what's in here before the reception ends." Lady Kang closed her eyes briefly, the way people do before stepping into cold water. "Show him." Ho Jin set the folder on the desk between them, and Minjae stared at it the way a man stares at a door he's suddenly certain he doesn't want opened, knowing, with the particular dread of someone who's built a career on reading rooms, that whatever was inside was about to rewrite everything he thought he understood about the woman he'd spent 3 years learning to hate. He reached for it anyway. The folder was thinner than 3 years of betrayal had any right to be. Minjae opened it slowly, the way a man diffuses something rather than reads it. The first item was a photograph, grainy, clearly pulled from an old security feed, time-stamped a little over 3 years ago. It showed the loading dock of the Kang shipping terminal at night, two men standing close together over an open crate, their faces caught at an angle that made identification unmistakable if you'd spent your whole life around them the way Min-jae had. His stomach dropped before his mind finished the calculation. "That's Sang-woo," he said. His cousin. Twice removed by blood, but never by trust. The man he'd handed the northern logistics routes to 5 years ago because he trusted him more than half the men who shared his last name outright. And that's... "Keep going," Lady Kang said quietly. The next page was a ledger, photocopied and annotated in a careful, unfamiliar hand, names circled in red ink, dollar figures beside them that made no sense against any legitimate account Min-jae had ever reviewed. Money moving sideways, siphoned through shell accounts registered to companies that existed only on paper, all of it threading back, invoice by invoice, to Sang-woo's division. "He's been bleeding us for years," Ho-jin said, slowly, carefully, enough to build his own war chest without ever tripping an alarm. "If your father were alive, he'd have caught it in a week. You were too busy fighting wars on the outside to notice the one starting on the inside." Min-jae's jaw tightened, "And you knew this, both of you, for 3 years." "No," Lady Kang said. She knew, 3 years ago, before any of us. The last item in the folder was a letter. Min-jae recognized the handwriting before he'd even unfolded it fully. Careful, deliberate. Each character formed like she'd been taught that words, once written, couldn't be taken back, so they'd better be worth the ink. Amma's handwriting. He read it twice before the words settled. "I found the ledgers in March. I confronted no one, because confronting them meant a war Min-jae wasn't ready to fight, and Uma wasn't strong enough to survive. I made a choice. I would rather he hate me for a lie than bury his mother over a truth revealed too early. If you're reading this, it means the time has finally come. Protect him. That's all I ever wanted to do." There was no signature. She hadn't needed one. Min-jae sat down slowly, the folder open on his knees, and for a long moment the study was silent except for the muffled sound of a string quartet through the walls, still playing to a ballroom that had no idea their entire understanding of the evening was currently being dismantled 20 feet away. "She let me hate her," he said finally, to no one in particular. "For 3 years, she let me tell people she was weak. She let me tell myself that." "She let you live," Lady Kang said. "There's a difference, though I understand it's not one you were prepared to see at the time." Min-jae's hands had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man doing math he didn't want the answer to. Sang-woo, his cousin. The man who'd sat beside him at his father's funeral, who'd toasted his engagement to Yuna not 6 months ago with a smile that had never once faltered. If the ledger was accurate, that same man was still inside the organization, still moving money, still... Min-jae's chest tightened at the thought. Still here tonight, somewhere in that ballroom, in a suit Min-jae had probably paid for, smiling at guests who had no idea they were standing 3 feet from a man quietly finishing what he'd started 3 years ago. "Where's Sang-woo now?" Min-jae asked, already rising. Ho-jin's face answered before his mouth did. "That's the other thing," he said. "He excused himself from the reception roughly 10 minutes ago, said he needed air. Nobody who needed air left in the direction of the family's private vault wing." Min-jae was already moving before he'd finished thinking it through, the folder still in his hand, 3 years of grief reorganizing itself in real time into something considerably more useful, rage with a destination. Behind him, he heard his mother's voice, low and urgent, calling for Ho-jin to alert security, and underneath all of it, a single thought looping with the persistence of a struck bell. Amma hadn't betrayed him. She'd been standing guard the entire time, alone, while he'd spent 3 years mourning the wrong version of the story, and somewhere in this house, the real villain was about to find out that the woman he'd counted on staying silent forever had finally decided her silence was over. The vault wing sat 2 floors below the ballroom, accessible by a private staircase disguised as a wine cellar door. A detail Min-jae's father had once called practical paranoia, and which Min-jae, sprinting down it 3 steps at a time in a wedding suit, was suddenly grateful for. He found Sang-woo exactly where a man with nothing to hide would never be, standing in front of the secondary server room, a keycard in his hand that he had no legitimate reason to possess. "Min-jae." Sang-woo's voice carried the easy warmth it always did, the same warmth that had fooled a room full of guests for 3 years, the same warmth Min-jae had once mistaken for loyalty. Shouldn't you be upstairs? It's your wedding. Funny, Min-jae said. I could ask you the same thing, except you don't have a keycard to this floor. I revoked it 2 years ago when we restructured access. Something shifted behind Sang-woo's eyes. Not panic, not yet, but the recalculation of a man realizing his timeline had just been compressed. I must have an old one. I'll have it deactivated. Don't. Min-jae held up the folder. I've read it. All of it. The ledgers, the dates, the shell accounts with your division's fingerprints all over them. He watched his cousin's face carefully, the way he'd watched 100 negotiations, looking for the exact moment a man's composure became a performance. 3 years, Sang-woo. 3 years you let me believe my wife left because she was weak, while you were quietly finishing the job she caught you starting. Sang-woo's smile didn't drop so much as it recalibrated, sharpening into something colder and considerably more honest. She was never supposed to find those ledgers. She wasn't even supposed to be looking. Your ex-wife had an unfortunate habit of paying attention to things that weren't her business. They were her business. She was my wife. She was an outsider who married in, Sang-woo said, and for the first time that night his voice carried real contempt, the kind that had clearly been rehearsed for years in rooms Min-jae was never invited into. A pretty distraction from Ghana who thought loyalty to this family was a two-way street. I gave her every opportunity to walk away quietly. She took it. I assumed that was the end of it. It wasn't, said a voice from the stairwell. Min-jae turned. Amma stood at the top of the steps, still in charcoal, still composed, though something in her posture now carried the coiled readiness of a woman who'd rehearsed this confrontation in her head more times than she'd ever admit. Behind her, Lady Kang and 2 of the estate's security detail moved quietly into position, boxing the corridor. You should have killed me when you had the chance, Amma said, descending the stairs slowly. Instead, you let me disappear and assumed a scared woman with a suitcase wouldn't keep copies. That was your first mistake. Your second was assuming 3 years of silence meant I'd stopped watching. Sang-woo's composure finally cracked. Just slightly, calculation flickering across his face as he glanced toward the server room door, toward the exits, toward the narrowing math of a man realizing every path out of this corridor now led through people who wanted him caught. You have no proof I did anything beyond what's in that folder. Moving money isn't a crime in this family, it's a tradition. The ledger has your authorization codes, Ho-jin said, arriving last, slightly out of breath, holding a second folder Min-jae hadn't seen yet. Codes that were used again 11 days ago, transferring $600,000 to an account in Macau. You weren't finishing an old job, Sang-woo. You were starting a new one. Tonight, in fact, while everyone was distracted by a wedding. The silence that followed had teeth in it. You were going to use my wedding as cover, Min-jae said slowly, understanding arriving the way understanding always did in this family, too late and considerably more expensive than it should have been. While everyone watched the bride, you were going to empty what's left. Sang-woo's hand moved, not toward a weapon, Min-jae would realize later, but toward the emergency override panel bolted beside the server room door, a last, desperate reach for a self-destruct sequence that would have wiped 3 years of evidence in under a minute. His fingers never reached it. The lights in the corridor cut to black. For roughly 4 seconds, the only sound in the corridor was breathing. 5 people, 1 traitor, all suddenly blind and recalculating. Then the backup lighting kicked in, dim and red, and Min-jae saw exactly what he expected to see. Sang-woo, halfway to the override panel, frozen not by fear, but by the barrel of a security officer's weapon now leveled at his chest from 6 feet away. Estate protocol, Ho-jin said calmly, tucking a small device back into his jacket, the same device, Min-jae now realized, that had cut the power the instant Sang-woo's hand moved. Cuts all non-essential power the moment someone touches that panel without clearance. Your father installed it after the incident with the fish market, actually. Funny how these things come full circle. Sang-woo's laugh came out thin, stripped of its earlier warmth. You're going to hand-deliver your own cousin to the police? In front of 300 wedding guests? Do you have any idea what that does to this family's reputation? Our reputation, Min-jae said, stepping closer, survived cartels. It survived prosecutors. It'll survive one coward who spent 3 years hiding behind a woman's silence instead of having the nerve to face me directly. He nodded to security. Take him to the East Study, quietly. My mother's guests don't need a floor show. As they led Sang-woo away, he twisted back once, something venomous and almost pleading in his expression. Ask her, he called, jerking his chin toward Amma, what it cost her to protect people who never once thought to check if she was even still alive. Ask her what loyalty got her. Nobody answered him. The stairwell door closed, and with it, 3 years of quiet architecture finally, definitively, collapsed. In the sudden stillness of the corridor, Min-jae turned to Amma. Under the red emergency lighting, she looked less like the elegant stranger who'd stood by the garden doors and more like the woman he remembered from before everything. Steady, watchful, carrying weight she'd never once asked anyone to help her hold. You could have told me, he said, quieter now. Any point in 3 years. One phone call. And said what? Amma's voice wasn't angry. It was tired, in the specific way of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation at 3 in the morning more nights than she'd ever admit. That your favorite cousin was robbing your family blind, and the only proof I had could get us both killed before you finished believing me? You were 29, Min-jae, freshly running an empire your father died defending. You needed an enemy you could see. I gave you one you could survive being angry at instead. I spent 3 years hating you. I know, she said. I read about your wedding in a newspaper. I told myself I was happy for you. A small, humorless breath escaped her. I was lying, but I told myself anyway. That's the version of loyalty nobody puts on the wedding invitations. Lady Kang, who had been silent through the exchange with the particular restraint of a woman choosing exactly the right moment to speak, finally stepped forward and took both their hands, one in each of hers, the way she must have done when they were newly married and she'd still believed the whole arrangement was going to work out simply. I am done watching this family confuse silence for weakness, she said. Your father built an empire on secrets, and it nearly buried all of us. I will not bury another year pretending everyone in this house is fine. She looked directly at her son. You have a wife upstairs who deserves an explanation you haven't given her yet. And you, she turned to Amma, her voice softening into something almost pleading, have spent 3 years alone protecting people who never once said thank you. I'm saying it now. Thank you. Amma's composure, so carefully held through cousins and conspiracies and confrontations in dim red light, finally wavered, not into tears, but into something quieter, a held breath finally released. Upstairs, faintly, the string quartet was still playing, 300 guests still waiting for a wedding that had quietly become something else entirely 20 minutes ago. Somewhere among them stood Seiyu Yuna, alone at her own reception, about to discover that the marriage she'd walked into that evening had never really been about her at all, and Min-jae, standing in a red-lit stairwell between his mother, his cousin's betrayal, and a woman he'd spent 3 years learning to hate for a sin she never committed, understood with sudden clarity that the hardest confrontation of the night hadn't happened yet. It was waiting for him at the top of the stairs, in a wedding dress. Yuna was exactly where he'd left her, standing near the head table, champagne untouched, watching the door with the particular stillness of a woman who'd had 20 minutes to construct several different versions of what she was about to hear and liked none of them. Where is she? Yuna asked before Min-jae had even fully crossed the room. Not a question, a demand dressed as one. Downstairs, with my mother. And Sang-woo? Word traveled fast in a house full of people paid to notice everything. Min-jae exhaled slowly. Being escorted somewhere considerably less comfortable than a wedding reception, Yuna set her glass down with the precise control of a woman refusing to let her hands shake in public. So it's true then, whatever this is, it's not gossip, it's not your mother being dramatic. Her eyes searched his face, and for the first time since he'd known her, Min-jae saw something under the careful composure that looked less like hurt and more like calculation. A woman recounting every conversation of their courtship, checking which parts had been true. 3 years, Min-jae. 3 years you told me she left because she couldn't handle the life. You let me believe I was marrying a man whose first wife ran when things got difficult. I believed that too, he said, and it cost him something to say it plainly. I believed it because it was easier than the alternative. Easier than knowing she stayed silent about a betrayal that could have gotten her killed, just so I wouldn't have to fight a war I wasn't ready for. And now? Now I know the truth, and it's worse, because it means I spent 3 years being angry at the one person who never stopped protecting this family, including me. Yuna was quiet for a long moment, the ballroom noise washing around them, a clink of glasses, the quartet finishing a song nobody was really listening to anymore, laughter from a corner of guests blessedly unaware that the wedding they'd attended had already had its climax and it hadn't involved a single vow. When she finally spoke, Her voice had lost its performance entirely. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I didn't fall in love with a man who was honest with me. I fell in love with a man who was careful with me, which I mistook for honesty because I wanted to. Tonight I learned there's an entire wing of your life I was never shown the blueprint to. That's not a small thing to discover at your own wedding." "No," Min-jae agreed. "It isn't. So here's my question, and I want the true answer, not the careful one." Yuna lifted her chin, and despite everything, despite the humiliation of the evening, there was something almost admirable in how steadily she asked it. "If she'd walked back into your life tonight and asked you to choose, right now in front of everyone, would there be a choice to make?" The honest answer arrived faster than Min-jae wanted it to, which told him everything he needed to know about how honest it was. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't need to. Yuna read it in the half-second of silence before he opened his mouth to answer, and something in her expression settled, not into heartbreak exactly, but into the calm of a woman who'd just been handed the one piece of information she actually needed. "That's what I thought," she said quietly. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad man, Min-jae. I think you're a man who's been protected from the truth so many times by so many people who loved him that you forgot what it feels like to choose it yourself." She slipped the ring from her finger with a steadiness that impressed him more than tears would have. "I won't stand at an altar tomorrow pretending tonight didn't happen. You should go find out what you actually want before you ask anyone else to build a life around it." She pressed the ring into his palm, and for a woman whose wedding had just publicly disintegrated, she walked away from the head table with more dignity than most people managed on their best day, pausing only once near the doors to glance back at him with an expression that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't cruelty either. Somewhere below them, Amma was still standing in a stairwell with a mother-in-law who'd just called her daughter in front of the entire underworld of Seoul, holding 3 years of grief she'd never once let anyone else carry for her. And Min-jae, standing alone now at the center of his own ruined wedding, understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the version of his life he'd spent 3 years building, the empire, the schedule, the careful, correct fiancé who fit every requirement except the one that mattered, had just been quietly, mercifully dismantled by a hug his mother gave someone else. He'd been given, against every intention in the room, a second chance. He wasn't going to waste it standing at a head table. He found her exactly where he expected to. Not inside, among the guests still murmuring their way through half-finished champagne, but out on the estate's east terrace, where the noise of the reception thinned to something almost bearable, and the Seoul skyline glittered indifferently beyond the garden wall. Amma stood with her arms crossed against the evening chill, a car already idling at the far end of the drive, her single suitcase, the same practical, unglamorous size that had carried her out of his life 3 years ago, sitting beside her like a decision already made. "You didn't say goodbye," Min-jae said. "I'm not sure I'm owed a goodbye scene," Amma said, not turning around. "I came because your mother asked. I stayed long enough to watch the truth do what I never had the courage to do myself. I think that's enough. It's not enough for me." That got her to turn. He crossed the terrace slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and when she didn't, he stopped an arm's length away, close enough to see that whatever composure had carried her through a ballroom ambush and a stairwell confrontation was finally, quietly wearing thin. "I spent 3 years being angry at a woman who doesn't exist," he said. "The version I built in my head left because she was weak, because she didn't want this life, because she didn't want me. Tonight I found out the real version stayed in the fight longer than I did, alone, and let me hate her so I wouldn't have to bury my mother." His voice caught just slightly on the last part. "I don't know how to apologize for 3 years. I don't think the words exist. You don't owe me an apology speech, Min-jae." Amma's arms uncrossed, though she still hadn't stepped closer. "I made the choice. I'd make it again. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel guilty enough to fix it. I'm telling you because I'm tired of being the only one who knows the truth. Then let me carry some of it now." He held out his hand. Not dramatically, not the way he'd rehearsed a wedding toast that would never be delivered tonight, but simply the way a man offers something he's afraid will be refused. "Stay. Not because my mother asked. Not because there's unfinished business with Sang-woo that'll take weeks to untangle in front of a judge. Stay because I'm asking you, for the first time in 3 years, without a folder of evidence forcing my hand." Amma looked at his hand for a long moment, and Min-jae understood, watching her, that whatever she decided next would matter more than anything he'd survived that night, more than cartels, More than prosecutors, more than a cousin currently sitting in his east study discovering exactly how thoroughly he'd underestimated the woman he'd once dismissed as a pretty distraction. "Your bride," Amma said quietly. "Where is she?" "She left, with more dignity than I deserved, and a piece of advice I intend to actually listen to this time." He didn't look away. "This isn't about replacing anyone, Amma. It's about finally telling the truth instead of managing it. I don't know what that looks like yet. I'd like the chance to find out. With you, if you'll let me." The car at the end of the drive was still idling, patient, indifferent to the fact that the woman it was waiting for hadn't moved in almost a minute. When Amma finally stepped forward and took his hand, it wasn't with the fireworks of a wedding day reunion or the swelling music of a reconciliation scene. It was quieter than that, steadier, the way two people rebuild something that was never actually broken so much as buried under 3 years of someone else's silence. "I'm not doing this because it's easy," she said. "I'm doing it because I'm done being the only one protecting this family from the truth. If I stay, we do it honestly. All of it. No more folders, no more secrets with expiration dates." "Agreed," Minjae said, and meant it more completely than he'd meant any vow he'd rehearsed for that afternoon. Behind them, through the terrace doors, Lady Kang watched from the threshold with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd spent 3 years waiting for exactly this moment and said nothing at all, because for once, in a house built on secrets, silence finally meant something worth keeping.